on the Yarra stage, cutting the bullshit out of startups. We're going to kick off. I'm really excited to introduce you to the two people who are running this session from Startup Onramp. Firstly, Colin Kenner, who is, in my world, he's an absolute legend. Colin, some of you may or may not know, was behind really kicking off the whole policy discussion on startups with the federal government, driving the ideas boom that was, and we won't comment on where it is now. So, you know, a giant brain who has now put a lot of that intellectual and, you know, real-world content into a Startup Onramp program. Complete legend. Nick Shuri.
How do I follow on from that?
About to build you up. Fellow Kiwi, famously built Biz Dojo, which was a large co-working hub in New Zealand, which he successfully exited. There's a whole story there. I'm not sure if he's going to tell you that, but if he doesn't tell you that story on stage today, you need to hit him up for it because it's an absolute classic. So yeah, we're happy to have him in Australia and working with Colin as entrepreneur in residence for the Startup Onramp. So I'm going to hand over to these two to cut the bullshit. Woo.
Thank you, Flo. So, thanks everyone for coming. I'm really pleased that we've got a full house. Fred was standing around the back. I think there's a couple of seats on this side. We thought it would be really interesting to just start off by understanding what everyone's working on. So, acoustics aren't going to be our friend, but can I just get a quick show of hands? If you can put your hand up if you're currently working in a startup.
Yeah.
So, more than half of you. Okay, put your hand up now if you are not currently working in a startup, but you want to be. Alright, and now raise your hand if you want to work in a corporate day job until you reach 65 and then retire. Please no. Okay, so philosophically, where Nick and I are coming from, I guess, is being very passionate about startups as a plan A rather than a plan B in terms of where people should invest their time and effort and direct their careers.
Well, part of it for me is I'm totally unemployable, so I either create a business or starve. So that's kind of it.
So a lot of the work that Nick and I have done over the last too many years is working with startup founders to help people get on that path of building companies, validating their ideas, and learning from the success of successful startup founders, and also learning from the failures. So being able to say, well, what are the things that most commonly lead to failure, and let's avoid doing those. So this is what Startup Onramp is. It's a crash course on how to start a startup and not screw it up. And I guess what we're trying to do, we're in week 7 of 12 of the Brisbane program, and we've already had a number of people go full-time on their startup, having made the decision that this is something they want to pursue. So that's kind of the vision that we have. So the topic for today is startups manage the bullshit. Both Nick and I have seen a lot of things talked about in the startup scene in terms of how you should do it, whether you should do it, what you should do to be successful. A lot of it's wrong. So we thought today would be a good opportunity to talk about some of the misnomers, some of the bullshit statements that you'll hear, and try to inject a little bit of reality into the discussion. So as you heard, Nick and I have both been involved in the startup scene for a long time. I guess, if anything, we can say that we have a very clear idea of what things consistently lead startup founders to succeed and what things lead them to fail.
Yeah, I suppose over the last 10 years I've probably worked with maybe nearly 2,000 companies, and often it's a lot of the same problems that kind of carry on through that as well. I will say though that there's no perfect 5-step technique to building success, but there is a whole bunch of things that people tell you that you should do and you'll be awesomely successful, which I think a big part for us is trying to break down those barriers. Luck, timing, and your personal ability to adapt, I think, is one of the key pieces. But, yeah.
We are going to leave some time at the end for questions, so can I encourage everyone to think of some questions as we go along. We'll try and touch on a whole bunch of stuff in the next 40 minutes, but we'd really love it if you could have some questions for the end. So I'm going to start with a quiz. This is a graph. For any of you who've seen it before, keep your hands down. Can anyone just yell out, what is this graph of? Just yell out. I'm going to give you a clue. It's one thing disrupting another thing. It's a common theme. No guesses.
My Tinder?
It is. It could be Tinder. It is WhatsApp overtaking text messages several years ago, and very, very rapidly and very significantly. The point of this is not whether it's WhatsApp overtaking text messages, is that this could be any number of industries or any number of products overtaking an incumbent. It could be music downloads replacing CD sales. It could be online travel versus travel agents. It could be remote co-working rather than in-person co-working. So the opportunity for startups is to do this. So I think one of the things that we see a lot of people do is think of really small ideas, and what we're really keen to help people to do is to think of ideas where you can overtake an entire industry like this. So the shortest definition that I've seen of what is a startup is this one by Paul Graham, who's one of the founders of Y Combinator, the arguably most successful startup accelerator in the world, based in Silicon Valley. And he talks about startup equals growth. And there's an essay which he wrote on that topic, and it basically pulls apart all of the reasons why, if you're starting a startup, your number one objective should be growth. And part of the rationale is that for any startup, the level of difficulty of growing a really small business that's only modestly successful is about the same as the level of difficulty of building a really big business. So why would you aim for a really small opportunity?
Not to mention we love Y Combinator because there's lots of different programs out there, but the thing I personally really dig about it is they like to surround an idea and a founder with a mentoring group of people who have made mistakes, had wins and those kind of things as well. It's really kind of founder-led rather than kind of idea-led, which I'm a big fan of.
So let's jump into some of the bullshit statements that we hear a lot of the time. So the first one we want to talk about is this. You often hear people say, I shouldn't tell people about my startup idea because somebody might steal it. Have you heard that happen, Nick?
Yeah, so in all fairness, I've been a founder for 16 years, and I have only ever had one idea stolen, literally. Now I know it's an interesting one to kind of say on the back of this, don't tell people, but one of the big things is it was a positive that this dude stole the idea because it was a pretty shitty idea, and I hadn't really formed it in my head, and I learned out of that process by what they then did. So I guess the big one is the more people you talk to, the more you share your concept, the faster you kind of get to that moment of going, how will I build this thing into a real thing? So don't hold any of your ideas close. Even in my case where I had an idea stolen, I still share everything because that's where you find people who want to help you move forward.
Even if you think about the logic behind keeping an idea a secret, if you need an investor, have you ever seen an investor say, sure, I'll sign a confidentiality agreement so you can tell me about your idea?
I'll never sign it.
So it goes out the window. So we don't want that. So bullshit statement number 2 is, I should ask my friends or my family or my co-workers for advice about this startup. Should I do it? How should I go about it? My personal view on this is that unless your friends or family have been wildly successful in multiple startups, they're probably not a good source of advice. And the phenomenon that we see is this, right? So they'll say, that's an awesome idea, I love it, great, you should go build that, I would so use that app.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a big part, part of your validation for those in the room who are either running startups or starting to scale those things. You've got to talk to as many people as humanly possible to that first slide. But the key one is you've got to work out how to kind of clear away the bullshit. Because some people will naturally go, I don't want to tell them that's a dumb idea. That's great. I would totally give you money if I had money. And you get this kind of like false sense of the importance of it, which is never a good idea.
So, as it happens last night in our Brisbane Startup Onramp group, we talked about customer validation and customer interviews. And one of the things we talked about was ice cream questions. So, if you've got kids, anyone who's got kids, you say, hey, would you like an ice cream? The answer is always, yeah, I love an ice cream. So what people often get wrong is they'll do customer interviews where they say, hey, if I built an app that saved you time and saved you money and gave you back a whole lot of additional revenue opportunities and it was only going to cost you $3 a month, would you buy it? Everyone's going to say yeah. So the better questions to ask are really deeply understand the problem that they have and how you might solve it, or what other solutions they've tried, and what other, how important that problem is to them before you try and sell them the solution.
I guess the other piece of this as well is your job as a founder is to try and look for the information between the questions, if that makes sense. You're trying to look for the stuff they're not saying, or you're interpreting information to see when there's a possible opening for an opportunity. If you are just basing your decisions and your growth idea on yes, you're likely to end with a bunch of no's, rather than actually really trying to find that sweet spot.
The downside of this is, of course, that there are people, and you probably met them, maybe some of you are them, where you see people spend inordinate amounts of their own savings, their own money, building a product, an app, a website, or whatever it is, without really being understood whether it's a good idea or not. And I feel somewhat responsible if we can help people to avoid spending $100,000 of their own money and then realizing it's a really bad idea. I think we feel obligated to try and help them figure that out really quickly.
And really quickly try and talk to the people who will actually pay you. It's amazing. We get to work with founders all day, every day, and it's interesting we sit down and say, hey, so all the people that are saying this are awesome, are they actually the customers? And 9 times out of 10 people go, oh, no. And you go, okay, so put your weight behind your conversations you're having with the people who actually have the money. Because ultimately you want that money to move from them to you. And so, just think about who you're talking to and what you want out of it really is the key piece.
So related to that concept, how do you actually know whether your idea is good? So this is kind of the $100 million question. How do you know if your idea for a startup is actually something you should pursue? So one way to think of it that I found is really helpful is to say, if you draw a Venn diagram, there's a couple of sets, and these are 2 sets you can think about in your mind to say, you can have ideas that sound crazy, and we've all seen those. Generating electricity using magnets. There's one that we hope to not see too many more of.
I've spent many hours trying to replicate those YouTube videos unsuccessfully. Damn it.
Yeah. There's another set of it is in fact a good idea. And the place that most people go fishing for ideas for startups is in the green circle. It's in things that are good ideas. The problem with things that are self-evidently a good idea is that there's probably 100 people working on it, because you're not the only smart person in the world. If it's a big enough opportunity, others will have spotted that opportunity. So where I think really good startup ideas tend to lie is in the intersect. If you can say, on first glance, this idea looks like it would really be very, very stupid, or really, really hard to make it work. But in fact, it is a good idea. So a classic example is Airbnb. So when Airbnb started, pretty much everyone said, this is really stupid. People are not going to give their house keys to some random stranger to earn a few bucks so they can stay in their house.
Yeah, absolutely. Or Uber, for example. Everyone kind of goes, now you go, well, it's a no-brainer, right? Transportation using a stranger's car. But in the early days, people were like, who would ever want to get in a stranger's car? This doesn't make sense. And so, as Colin said, again, this comes to the question of how you find the money. Try and look at the edge limit of where those things are. Not too crazy so that you're 2 years or 3 years ahead of the market, but just enough that you're in that new territory where you perhaps have less competitors. So there's a really cool piece of methodology that came out of Queensland around Horizon 1, Horizon 2 and Horizon 3 innovation. You're trying to sort of aim for that 2 to 3, which is kind of like something transformational, opening a new market. That's if you're trying to build something that's a globally scalable business.
So a related point to this is that we were talking just before about asking friends, family, or people who don't know much about startups for advice. What you often see is if you have what is in fact a really awesome idea, because it sits in this intersect between sounds crazy and is in fact good, the feedback you'll generally get from the people you ask is, yeah, look, I think it sounds like a really bad idea, you should give up. And that's what people do, right? So that's something to think about if you're at the idea stage, is don't be discouraged by the fact that a lot of people will think your idea is crazy.
Yeah, and failure, welcome it. Welcome people's criticism. Welcome them saying, I think that's crap, I don't see how that'll work. And don't take personal attack. Take it as how do I keep tweaking my idea? How do I keep evolving it? And one of the things that we find with our Onramp cohort at the moment, don't be precious about it. Know when to pivot, because if you're in the pursuit of the money at the end, you've got to keep doing this the whole time. Otherwise, if you hold on, you'll think your idea is awesome. No one's really wanting to pay you, and you just lose traction and it dies.
Okay, so bullshit statement number 3, we hear this a lot, is that I need to be a programmer to do a startup. They're tech companies, they involve writing a lot of software. If I am not a programmer and I can't write software, I shouldn't even start. I'm going to lead off on this one by saying I think that's actually partially true, and the reason I think that is that it is really hard, but I'm going to also balance that by saying, here are some examples. So here's one that you might have heard about recently. Brisbane startup called Go On, which just closed a $30 million funding round from Microsoft's venture capital arm, and it was started by an economist and a medical doctor, and it's a software company.
So part of that thing of sharing your ideas is, and something we do with our cohort, I don't have a particular set of skills. I go straight on LinkedIn and say, hey, I'm looking for a technical advisor, I'm looking for a CTO, I'm looking for a CMO, head of marketing, I'm looking for the things that I'm not good at. And by having that confidence to go out there and say, I've got an idea, but I really miss these skills, what actually ends up happening is people are drawn towards you and they go, hey, I really love your idea, how could I become your CFO?
So a couple of other examples just to really make this point. If you read the Courier Mail yesterday, you would have seen these guys, Connor and Alex, two founders of Explorate, which is a Brisbane startup that's doing great things in the ocean freight shipping industry. They likewise are a couple of guys who are not programmers, but they're actually learning. I think they were talking yesterday that they are learning and building a team who have the deep programming skills that they need as they grow the business, but it is actually very possible to learn enough to make a start, and there are a whole bunch of free tools that you can use if you're not a programmer.
Yeah, often I try and sort of say to founders, you've got to think of yourself as a conductor of an orchestra. You need to understand how the bass trombone operates or how the violin operates in that band scenario, but you don't need to be the best person playing it, but you need to know what sounds good. And so, try and understand all of the moving parts, but know how you bring them together as one beautiful piece of music.
I'm going to give you one other really quick example. This is a company called SurePact, founded by an amazing entrepreneur called Megan Navarre. SurePact's actually a startup program alumnus. They came through our program about 18 months ago. Megan has been successful in building a tech team, and the thing that I think any startup founder can emulate from SurePact's journey is the vision and the drive of the founder. So if you as a founder or as a team of founders can show that you're passionate about your idea, that there's a massive opportunity, and that you've got a vision for how you're going to capture that opportunity, it's actually not hard to get people to come on that journey with you. So I think if you can get good at explaining why you're passionate about your idea and how much of an opportunity there is for it, bringing people on that journey is probably easier than you would think. So, still on the topic of building product, another one of my favorites is I can get a developer to build my product in return for equity. And usually, people who have not done this before will say, like 2%. Well, it's my idea, so I should have 98% of the company because it's my idea and that's where the value lies, right, Nick?
Yeah, look, and I guess if you think about the personalities, right, usually a designer or a sales or a marketing person is kind of a personality, kind of extroverted. Often, and this is not always the case, often a developer or a program or a technical resource is more of an introverted personality. So they would like some stability, they kind of like the idea of taking some equity on, and they'd be interested in some ESOP, but at the end of the day, they'd quite like to get paid. and we're dealing in an age where developers are sought after. So, they can command really high remuneration. So you're already on the back foot if your goal is to turn around and say, hey, but I'll give you 25% of this thing. That's pretty challenging. Work out how you can find the money to hire someone and get them working with you.
So the theme that we often see is this, that people assume that the developers are hungry for work and they work for a very small amount of money. The good news is that in Queensland we actually have the very fortunate position of having a whole stack of funding options available. So one classic one that everyone should be aware of is the Queensland Government's Ignite Ideas grants, which are really valuable. They're non-equity taking funding, so it's free money. It's pretty competitive, so you need to make a pretty good case, but there have been a number of rounds, and a lot of the companies that are here are actually recipients of the Ignite Ideas grant, and that's a fantastic way to take something that's got a little bit of early traction, maybe a crappy MVP, and bring it from there to being a fully fledged product. So I think from a Queensland Government perspective, that's one of the things I'd say is a really valuable asset.
So there's another grant as well, which you can get access to. I'm terrible, I don't know the name of it, but if you go onto the Advanced Queensland funding page and search the grants there's actually one that's designed around fresh graduates. So, go and talk to your universities, go and talk to some of those engineering departments and actually help get someone a job at the post of that. So that can often be up to $20,000, I believe, of their first year salary. So that can make a huge difference to your fledgling startup idea to actually go out there. Your number one job as a founder is to hustle every possible angle you can, whether it's customers, funding, advertising, marketing, us, everything. Hustle, 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 hustle.
Totally. Alright, so a show of hands, how many of you have written a business plan for a startup? Please put it down again. Okay. The school of thought on business plans has changed quite a bit in the last 5 or 10 years. It used to be perfectly valid that people would say, you're starting a new business, you should write a business plan, because that's going to help you think through all the stuff. There's a venture capital fund in Silicon Valley that says on their website, when we invest in a startup, we want to know that the founders have written a business plan, just please don't send it to us. So what they're saying is the process of thinking about all the stuff that might go on a business plan is pretty useful, but actually the document is largely a work of fiction. It's not very useful. So in terms of all the bullshit statements that we're going to talk about today, this one gets the award for the large steaming pile of BS.
It's also the one that's probably the most irrelevant, because you'll never get money from a bank, usually. Apologies to any banks that might be in the room. But if you go and try and borrow a personal loan to start your business, they will fall off their chair laughing and come back with a business plan, which is a really nice way of saying don't ever come back. There's some really good methodologies around using a lean canvas or a business canvas, and we're big believers that systematically work out what your value proposition is, what your customer is, who they are, and what your value you're going to be doing. I mean, we're not against that stuff, but it's a living organism, and it will evolve constantly as you go forward with your business. So don't waste time writing a 30-page report on what your thing might be, because that'll be obsolete within 12 weeks anyway.
So there's a really good quote that I like from the co-founder of Startup Weekend, who said, business plans are as good as following directions given by a blind chimpanzee. So if you ever find yourself tempted to start writing a document with the word business plan on the front cover, just remember that quote. Okay, so the startup ecosystem really relies a lot on mentors, and this term mentor has kind of come into the lexicon. It's kind of weird because I don't think mentoring is actually the right term for it, but you'll hear a lot of people saying, I need to find a successful entrepreneur to be my mentor because I want to learn what they've done. I think there's a huge amount of value from talking to successful entrepreneurs as well as unsuccessful ones to learn from their experiences, but I think there is a real danger. One of the dangers is this is a tweet from an investor in the US who says, when successful people give advice, it's a bit like they're saying, here are the lottery numbers I'm playing, why don't you give it a try? So this particularly applies to one-time successful entrepreneurs who've been successful once.
And look, I guess as one of those people that find myself often working with founders giving advice, from my perspective, you should, how many of you are parents? How many of you have got kids? Yeah, a few hands around the room. Everyone gives you advice on how to be a parent. And your job as a parent is to kind of clear away the shit and go, thank you very much, appreciate that, Grandma, awesome, I'll take that under advisement. And that's part of your job as a founder is with advice. Everyone will tell you how to do it. Your job is to work out how much of what they're saying is crap and what stuff they need to take away. The big thing for me when I'm talking to a founder is I'm sharing the things that I've actually fucked up. These are the things that I did. This is what happened when I did it. And for you, that's your pathway to maybe navigate around that. So usually when you're trying to extract information from investors, advisors, mentors, or whoever it is, work out what they did wrong, what they did right, how they navigated around it, and see if that's applicable to you. Otherwise, throw it away.
Okay, so we're up to number 7. I have to quit my job before doing a startup. This is perhaps one of the most damaging myths that we see in the startup ecosystem. I'm constantly meeting people who I think would be really awesome startup founders who have an idea that they want to work on, and they've got the passion, they've got the skills, they've got some really deep insights that will allow them to go and solve the problem really well, but they just don't pursue it. And often it's because they say, well, I've got a job and, maybe I've got a mortgage or I've got financial commitments. How can I do that? It doesn't compute. And I think it's a myth, right? So one of the things that people can really do a lot of is make progress in their startup from the safety of their day job, whatever that might be. And you can do a bunch of things, interview customers, you can create a website, a landing page. We talked a couple of weeks ago with the Brisbane group about naming and branding. Get the .com, and it's really hard, of course, because all good .coms are taken for anyone who's tried it. But start something, and very quickly you can make progress, and then think about quitting your day job.
Think about it as runway, right? And one of the coolest ones that Colin had kind of said once, you don't have to jump out and start your startup until your boss is literally about to put you under professional management. So how much can you get? That's his word on mine. I'm unemployable, so it doesn't really matter. But think about it as a pathway. And one of our cohort at the moment has a really successful job, and what that's allowing him to do is be able to take a portion of his income and actually hire resources to help him move things forward. So he's building up that baseline so that when he gets ready, he can actually make the transition out. Now, it's important for you to know what is the point that you jump out and start your startup full time, because you eventually will need to, but don't do it prematurely, because if you're dealing with the pressure of your partner saying, so why can't we pay the mortgage this month? And you're like, because I believe in my startup. That can add a lot to your life. So be considered, think about it, and make small investments towards that end game. And be real. That's why there's another slide coming up that I would jump.
Yeah, let's talk about this. So one of the things that you need to get real about is pigs versus chickens. That's obvious, right? So pigs and chickens is a reference to breakfast, right? So if you're making bacon and eggs, the pig is 100% committed to the outcome, whereas the chicken is not. So this comes into play when you're talking to investors. So if an investor says, I'm considering making an investment of $100,000 in your company, this is the point where you have to be a pig. You have to be 100% committed. You cannot say to any investor, I'll happily take the money and put it in my bank account, but I'm going to keep my day job, or I'm going to do some consulting 3 days a week, and I'll work on this as a side hustle. That's pretty much the point where you have to go all in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had this conversation yesterday with one of our cohort, and look, and it is tough. I'm a extroverted, emotional decision maker, so I literally leap off the edge of the cliff and go, should I have my parachute? Oh my God, I don't actually know how to swim. And the water's coming up fast. So, that's why I'm a massive believer that if you can find a co-founder relationship, actually the balance between the male mindset and the female mindset can be super, super powerful for a startup. In my experience, I've often had female founders who think a little bit deeper than I do, because I'm just running off the edge of the cliff, and they're like, maybe we should work out how this thing actually makes money first thing. And so try and get the right team around you as well. That's really important.
Absolutely. All right, number 8. You have to be under 30 to do a startup. Has anyone heard that? It's closely related to the you have to be a white Caucasian male under 30. There's a whole lot of stereotype bullshit going around. There are actually some advantages to being a younger entrepreneur. So let me just show you 3 advantages. So if you can see these smiling faces, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, and Larry and Sergey, the Google founders. So they were all pretty young when they started, and they've done okay. So being young is an advantage in as much as it typically means you can live pretty cheaply. Your risk tolerance may be somewhat higher than someone who's got kids and mortgages and a career that you've invested a lot in. And that's all fine. The assets that you have on the line might look something like this. I think this is actually my car when I was about 21. The problem with being a young entrepreneur is that often people who want to be entrepreneurs but haven't had a lot of life experience come up with pretty crappy ideas. So these are just some examples of peer-to-peer driveway parking apps developed by students at startup weekends. And this is only a small sample of several hundred who have come up with the exact same idea. So Nick and I both mentored at a bunch of startup weekends and other hackathons, and invariably you see people come up with ideas like an app for ordering beer to deliver it to my house, an app for sharing my driveway so I can make an extra $5 on a Saturday when people want to park for the football. So not at all to take away from real entrepreneurs, but I think back to Nick's point about teams, a diverse team where you have people who are young, risk tolerant, and can live on noodles for a long time and be in cockroach mode is valuable, but also I think having people with deep experience in the problem area that you're working in is really important.
Yeah, and look, some basics around that is as soon as you get traction with your business and you haven't had experience managing staff, you haven't had experience firing people, it's all like, beers on Fridays and then, catastrophic, some catastrophic thing happens. There's no substitute for life experience, and I'm also a massive believer that have a deep domain expertise and have a real passion for an area of what you do with your startup. And we see it with a lot of our cohorts where they really, really deeply understand an area of pain, and they've kind of gone through that life journey to then turn around and go, right, now how can I solve this pain? If I'm experiencing it, how can I solve this for many others, and how can I turn that into a business model? Rather than kind of like fresh out of uni, I want to be an entrepreneur but I don't really know what my problem is I'm solving, and I'll just replicate the other next good idea.
The phrase we often use is that people marinate in the problem. So you'll see the companies we mentioned before, Go1, Explorate, SurePact, they're all founded by people who have worked in that particular domain area for 5, 10 or more years. And they've spent that time marinating in the problem, so thinking deeply about it, and their chances of having a really good insight that will allow them to go and solve that problem are so much higher than someone coming out of cold.
That's probably what I find for most businesses, mine and every other business I've had in. It's usually around year 5 of your operation that you start to get that step change, because you've spent 5 years kind of making all the wrong decisions and stuffing things up, and then you're like, the penny kind of drops and you go, right, now I actually understand what I'm doing. And so, it's also too, we live in a more complicated world these days, so some of the ideas that were shown in the previous one, you require deeper stack ideas now. So even look at Uber, for example, now you have to do an entire stack startup like Lime. You have to not just have an app, you actually have to have all the infrastructure, all the hardware, all of those things set up. So it takes more energy, effort, investment, time and thinking to get to those points. So, if you want to build a $100 million business, really deeply understand something that's wrong and then work out how to solve that problem for many other people.
Alright, so the next bullshit statement we hear a lot is that people feel that they need to raise money from an investor so they can start their startup. So has anyone ever tried pitching Steve Baxter or any other well-known investor with an idea? How'd it go, David? Friendly enough? Did he give you any money? No. So there are almost no investors who will invest in an idea, and so it would be fantastic. I would love it if there were people who would give you money and say, that sounds like it could be a good idea. Here's $100,000 to go and figure out whether it's a good idea. The unfortunate truth is that just doesn't happen. So if you will need to raise money from investors, which for most startups you really will, because you need to grow fast. You need to be thinking about, how do I generate some early traction, early sales, early evidence that there's a business here, and not just an idea that might not actually be a business.
Also too, if you're a technology product and you're sitting down in front of an investor, and a couple of years ago I started a new global software product, and I pitched to maybe 35 VC funds across New Zealand, Australia and Southeast Asia. I got nice solid fuck-offs because I kept talking about the dev stack, I kept talking about developing our product. Where we got into trouble was the fact that what we should have been talking about was a growth plan. So this is how we're acquiring customers, this is how much of our customer acquisition strategy is actually towards development. Because what an investor cares about is the return on that money. They don't want to be helping you build out your software, what they want to be helping you do is acquire more customers. So, go in armed with what they care about, which is more business, not a cooler product.
Having been on the investor side of the fence a number of times, you can always tell when a startup team doesn't know what levers to pull to achieve growth. It's because on their customer acquisition slide in their pitch deck, they always have about 10 bullet points. And it says we're going to do Facebook and AdWords and talk at conferences and get some PR and use viral methods. It means they don't know. So from an investor point of view, if that startup can show up and say, the one thing that's going to be most useful to generate traction, it's this, and we just need your capital to be able to pull on that lever really hard, that's a good story to say to pitch to an investor. So one of the other reasons that startups can actually make a lot of progress early on is some of the really cheap or free tools, and these are just a selection that I think most startup founders should have a look at. I should say, actually, all of these slides I'm happy to share with anyone who wants them, so if you come and grab us afterwards, happy to email you this to save you having to take this down.
And I guess that one as well, we've never lived in an age where it's easier or faster to spin something up. I mean, you can spin up a website, a prototype, a type form, a spreadsheet. You can actually be taking money from someone within sort of 24 to 48 hours easily. You can be actually having a landing page for someone to test your idea within an hour. So, we live in a gifted time. So, there's nothing stopping you getting your message out to the world. It's just about you doing that fast and not wasting time. Even Uber and all these guys, they used all of these tools to build out their platform for years. They were hacking Intercom, they were hacking Stripe, they were hacking all these things. Don't build anything from scratch. Just use the stuff.
All right, so we're getting to almost Q&A time. Number 10, I should raise money from friends and family. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you have done that, but it's a pretty common phenomenon. People will say, well, my Uncle John was got a bit of money, he's happy to give me 50 grand to go and help start this company, or I've got someone to work with, or my lawyer, my dentist, or whatever. That can be good, but I wanted to just share a good rule of thumb that I found can be helpful when you're thinking about this. That is that smart involved money is better than dumb passive money, which in turn is better than dumb involved money. So smart money in this instance means people who will add value to your business. Either they've been successful as startup founders themselves, or they know your industry, or they can bring you customers. Dumb money is people who just don't know anything and they're not going to contribute. The reason dumb involved money is really bad is that these are the people that think they know how you should run your company, and they will try to tell you, and if you have them as an investor and a shareholder in your business, they're there forever. They will get in your way and make life difficult.
So I had a startup back in NZ that ended up at a Series B from a huge global entity. They went into that with a cap table that had nearly 58 small shareholders in it. Friends, family, mates, it was a total mess. It cost millions just to buy all of those people out, to sort that out. If you are going to open yourself up to have a whole group of people like that, there is structures that you can create in your business to keep that clean, because any seasoned VC or funder is going to look at it and go, your mum's awesome, but I don't really want to have to sit around a board meeting with your mum and argue with like what the business should be doing. So, you know, you need to have a good structure. So think about cap tables, think about your investment plan, think about all those things at the start, because you can make decisions really quickly that have a really long tail, as Colin was saying. They're with you for years.
Okay, quickly, the last couple. Number 11. I should get my product perfect before launching it. This is a real life issue for the current startup Onramp group that's running in Brisbane, and also the others in other parts of Queensland. Everyone naturally is inclined to not want to launch a product when it's still crappy. The best thing you can do is launch your product while it is still crappy, because it's a fantastic opportunity to get feedback and learn from potential users whether you have built the right product and what features they will or won't use. So Reid Hoffman, founder of LinkedIn, is famously quoted as saying, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've launched it too late. And if you look at the first version of LinkedIn, it's absolutely that. It's embarrassingly bad. This was 2003, I believe. And if you look at any wildly successful tech company, and you look at the first version of their product, the Facebook, with one user being Mark Zuckerberg, in, what was this, 2005, pretty crappy. So launch early and be crappy.
Yeah, you know, as quick as you can, start getting your idea in front of a customer and see if they're interested in giving you money or telling you about it.
We're going to take some questions. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I would love it if we've got a microphone, Flo's going to pass around. I would love it if we have a few questions.
I have a question on MVPs and launching a crappy product. How do you mitigate risk when you're working in sensitive environments, so healthcare, that kind of thing? I mean, that's kind of where I am at the moment, and we have something, but if something goes wrong, we could be in a lot of trouble. So how far do I push MVP, and how do I balance that risk with not having to make it perfect?
So I'll repeat that back. So how do you mitigate risk with a potential customer with your MVP, and how far do you push that? So had an interesting conversation with one of our cohort yesterday who's dealing with big data, and one of his kind of challenges when he's talking to customers is we're a bit worried that you're a startup and we're nervous about you managing our multi-billion-dollar data set. One of the things that we came up with was, okay, so how do you create a partnership and work with someone else who's really good at managing data? Are there other partners out there using blockchain like Leverage that you could be actually working with to then use their technology and add your layer and your value on top of that? I think it's also important about trying to work with that customer to give them a sample of their data set, sign NDAs, and actually have some stuff in there. So even if you have to use dummy data to begin with to start building that credibility, probably the easiest way that I think you go about it is really clearly mapping out how you will address security as you scale your idea. These are the partnerships, this is the framework we work on, this is how we're addressing it. It's not a perfect fix, but you know, there are other companies out there that can solve probably that problem for you. Just look at how you can integrate or plug into them for an API.
Are there any other bullshit questions that you've encountered in talking about startups that you'd like to raise?
You've completely stripped the bullshit.
I mean, look, you know, starting a business and doing that is an incredibly rewarding experience and also really daunting. Think of yourselves as explorers. If we went back a few hundred years, you'd be the people sailing off to the new lands. So it's an itch that once you have, it's really hard to put away, and it's really enjoyable to do something that you can create that has a legacy beyond you as well. So go for it.
Cool. Hey guys. What are some of the intangible benefits that are not often spoken up front about the benefits of taking part in the Start Onramp program that's been run right across Queensland? What's the what next that people could expect?
Let me try and answer that. So David's actually one of our facilitators in Toowoomba. So the Start Onramp program started in Brisbane but with some financial support from the Queensland government, we're in the process of rolling it out to about a dozen regional startup hubs around the state, as well as further afield in other states. And what we're starting to see is that it's, as a program or as a process that people can go through, it's pulling people out of traditional day jobs working in corporate land or working in government or running their own consulting business, and giving them a quick exposure to how they might change from selling time to selling an asset. And personally, I think anyone who continues in this century to sell their time as their primary means of earning a living, really needs to have a look at whether they should continue doing that. And I think what we're seeing is the program is helping people open up their eyes to opportunities and start to explore ways that they could build an asset, build a technology company as an alternative. And it's fantastic to see regions like Toowoomba running that program and starting to get some of those results.
So maybe when I first started my first startup 16 years ago, I felt like I had no mates. It was like everyone I talked to worked in a proper job, and they were like, "You're a lunatic. Why would you do this? Go and get a job now." And one of the awesome things that I see out of whether it's the Startup Onramp program or other kind of cohort-led programs is the camaraderie that you build with your cohort. We've got a group of 12 amazing people kind of at different stages in their lives, at different points, having gone through different experiences, all sharing their combined knowledge. So our role in this is a facilitator and a guide where we don't have all the answers, and our role is to try and help you navigate through some of these challenges. But it's the camaraderie that comes out of those people that's really powerful as well, and giving them a sense of their own authorship in their own lives. No one wants to feel like a number, and I guess the thing for me is I wanted to know if I wasn't getting paid, like I knew that I wasn't getting paid because that was on me. I like having a salary in my day job, but part of it for me is I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And being an entrepreneur, being a founder, sometimes you know too much, but there's a sense of no surprises for you because you're the person at the helm of that. That's not for everyone, but I think once you've got that bug, it's a really cool thing. And to know that you could create something that creates jobs for other people. I mean, there's something really, something pretty amazing about that, to know that the moment that my previous company had 75 staff, I felt overwhelmed, but I also felt this huge sense of pride that an idea that could barely pay me on day one, 9 years later had 70 people who were going and buying houses and doing things and off that idea. So there's something really magical out of that. I loved, but it wasn't for me. I should stop talking.
Alright, that was an amazing session. Thank you both so much, Colin and Nick. Sign up for Startup Onramp program. You may save yourself years of pain and suffering. You do that if you're at idea stage right now.